You are in the right webinar if you've come to hear about conversation and how we can improve, I suppose, the conversations that we have in school and how we can use conversation to support our well-being ourselves and with our colleagues. And I am really delighted to introduce this panel to you today of friends and just great people who've got a fantastic perspective to bring to this conversation. So let me introduce them. We've got Ella Hughes, who's head of a primary school in Manchester, but is also a coach. And she's worked in a variety of different sites in the UK and in New Zealand, and so is bringing us the richness of that perspective into the conversation. We then have Mike Armiger, and Mike works with health and education teams on trauma-informed practice, both practice and also system stuff. So Mike is working at different levels, I guess, with institutions and also authorities and trusts and so on, and has all sorts of expertise to bring to this. Apart from his work with children who have social and emotional and mental health issues or SEND issues or trauma, he also does work with reflective practice and suicide prevention, and is an author and was a professional rugby player. And I'm just stopping now, Mike, because otherwise you'd be shown off. So it's delightful to have you here today. And then the marvelous Dr. Emma Kell is also in the house. And Emma is a writer and a researcher on wellbeing and education. She is a deputy head. She has worked with vulnerable young people in multiple settings. She's involved in teacher training. And again, I'm going to stop because all three of our panelists have done so many brilliant things. It would take too much of our time to go through them all. So let me just say it's fabulous to have you all here today. And to say a little bit about education support, my name is Sinead McBrearty. I'm the chief executive of the charity. The charity's been around for 145 years and exists to support and improve the mental health and well-being of everyone working in education across all settings. And today's webinar is part of the kind of work that we try to do to have events where we bring people who are in the sector, working in schools, working with children and young people, working with school leaders and with staff in schools to talk about the issues that we think are important, and that those of you who are on the webinar and people like you have asked us to put some content around. So really pleased to be on this topic today. So let's get stuck in. We're talking about conversations. Why we're having this conversation is because of the link, and I guess we'll explore this, between having good conversations and our own well-being, our own resilience, our ability to do the job that we love well, and actually to love the job that we do, all of those things at once. I'm going to start by asking, and maybe Mike, I'm going to kick off with you, but I'm going to come to both Emma and also Ella on this. Why are conversations really that important? Can we really make this claim for them that conversations are that powerful that they can transform our well-being? And if so, what is going on there? How's that happening?
Thank you for coming to me first. No, hi everyone. It's really good to be with you all. Why do we really need conversations, and why they're powerful? So for me, I kind of see conversations as the next step after a thought, right? So normally conversations follow on from something existing inside our head. And whether that be a viewpoint, whether that be an experience that we have, whether that be an opinion, or whether it be something that we are just pondering on, the next step ordinarily is to either want to know more about that thought, to discover the power of that thought, and whether it has power over us, whether it has power over other people, whether it has some familiarity with other people's experiences, whether they too share in what we've been thinking maybe. There's multiple ways that you can go about it. And in my role, I tend to see a lot of people who have been thinking things for quite a long period of time, and it's been quite debilitating for them quite often. And those thoughts have sometimes only ever existed in their head. And I tend to see two sorts of things when conversations take place. I tend to see a liberation, in that people can feel lighter, they can feel more informed. Actually, sometimes people talk to think as well, don't they? So it's an extension of their existing thought process. So some people, like myself, I'm that very annoying person that will want to talk something to death for absolutely ages before I really arrive at a solution or a finishing point. And then there's the other response, which is that people sometimes, when they have a conversation, they immediately afterwards find it quite difficult. There can be that sort of upheaval element that sometimes people can feel, but later they tend to fall into a much more sense of balance. So the immediate reaction versus the long-term reaction might be different, but what we see as a similarity across both those types of groups of people really is that they tend to arrive at a different destination. Now, we can all talk about what type of destination that might be. Let's be honest, sometimes that can be more difficult, sometimes it can be much better. But for me, conversations are an extension of thinking. And it's only when we're able to get that thinking out into the open sometimes that we have the ability to see things maybe from someone else's perspective, and that somebody else adds to our own perspective as well. So just a very, very quick example to finish with. I have lots of conversations all the time with lots of different people. And what I find is that bits of those conversations add to my own narrative and my own understanding of the world, my own understanding of myself. So I tend to liken conversations to almost reading another book. You get a chapter of somebody else's story, and maybe a paragraph of that chapter might be inserted into your own. And actually, through lots of different conversations, eventually we write all of these different chapters that might have started with other people, but help us start to make sense of our own thinking and our own lives as well. So that's where I would start, and that's really sort of what I see conversation as.
That's lovely, Mike. I'm gonna segue to Ella, because you just finished on the metaphor of book there, and since you are so beautifully surrounded by books, Ella, where do you sit with this conversation piece?
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, that was very eloquently put by Mike. I would echo a lot of what he said. I think for me, conversation is really tied up in connection and curiosity. I think those are kind of two words that would fit very much with what Mike's just talked about there. So absolutely, I can walk around with the thoughts that I have in my head, but that puts me isolated as one unit. When I articulate those thoughts or feelings out loud, when I use my words to converse with somebody else or to listen to them conversing, then I'm connecting with those people, and that's how you build relationships. And certainly for me, relationships are the absolute heart of everything at home and at work, socially, personally, professionally. And the way that I develop trust and understanding in those relationships is through conversations with people, because that's one of the many ways that we can connect. And I think it's also very much about, I already know what I know. It's only through those connections and curiosity in other people that I can broaden that viewpoint, those experiences, to connect with other people's lives. And that can be really enriching for everybody, personally and professionally. And I also think conversations are massively important for breaking down stigma and isolation. I think, lots of the narrative that's out there around things that have been historically taboo, whether that's something like miscarriages, stillbirth, grief, bereavement, alcoholism, mental health needs, those stigmas persist because of silence. And it's conversation that helps break down those taboos and stigmas and drive things forward. You look at things like the Black Lives Matter movement, conversations around the safety of women. It's only by talking those things through and connecting and being curious with each other that we can start to break down some of those barriers and boundaries and kind of push things forward for individuals and society as a whole.
That's lovely, Ella. Thank you. And Emma, I know you're a great woman for data. And thank you for correcting my misintroduction of you, by the way. I appreciate it. See, I for detail, you wouldn't have missed it, would you? But the data is always very important, but you're steeped in that, but you're also routinely having conversations with people about their well-being and mental health. And when you think about conversations in that sense, how do you think about them?
Yes, I mean, just the word data makes me shudder slightly, actually. I'm all about the conversation, and I have the great privilege of spending most days, every day, having conversations, coaching conversations, well-being conversations with people. So three points I'd make. Firstly, I love what Ella said about curiosity and being a researcher in education and well-being. I remember reading somewhere, someone saying, I'm just insatiably nosy. I'm really nosy. I find that people are so interesting. So I get to have those conversations and add extra chapters to my book, as Mike put it. I'd say, yes, as Ella said, it's about human connection. So if we flip it on its head, think about times in your lives when a conversation hasn't happened. You know, you took that group of students to France over half term and no one had a conversation about it. No one said, oh goodness, that must have been really rewarding, but really hard work. And thank you for that. And often when wellbeing issues come up in schools, it's because conversations just haven't been had because the time hasn't been made for them. Secondly, just to go back to something Mike said, a lot of people, and I am doing this now, verbally process their thoughts. As I'm saying this, I'm thinking, gosh, yes, conversations are really important, aren't they? You know, we verbally process. So when I work with a lot of coaches, some like a nice model, others say, can we just talk and see where we end up? And we might start talking about life and end up that we are actually talking about work and the relationship with the boss. Or we might start talking about lesson planning and actually we're really talking about that one's closest relationships at home. So processing through conversation. And finally, for me, a lot again of well-being challenges and issues come around the unknown and the uncontrollable and the chaos that is the world and the what do people really think of me and the, you know, what if this person's thinking this? And if we have a conversation, we take control. I was coaching someone just earlier this week and they said, you know, the way that person spoke to me was not okay. That was not okay. And I told them it was not okay. I sat down with them politely over a cup of coffee and I said, that wasn't, I wasn't comfortable with the way you went about that. And I feel so much better now. I feel peaceful. I feel calmer. I get it. You know, that person's apologized perhaps. So it's about taking control of the chaos that is around us, I think. Taking a deep breath and having that conversation.
So Emma, in that then, if people are sitting here thinking there are conversations I need to have, there are conversations that I would like to have, how do we set ourselves up to have a good conversation, to approach it in a way that's going to, you know, give us a good outcome?
Well, so the first thing to say is that it's far easier in the short term, just as it's far easier for me to sit at this desk all day and not go for my lunchtime walk, it's far easier not to have one, isn't it? You just go, oh, well, oh God, I'm feeling a bit, you know, feeling a bit irritable. Oh God, that person's annoying. It's far easier to go and whinge about them in a cupboard with someone else. But actually, it's far better to have the conversation than not have it. Think back to times in your lives, we've all had them, where we said, actually, husband, it's really hard when you're away half the time and I have to look after the kids on my own. And actually just saying it, suddenly the weight lifts, doesn't it? So there's whole books written about this. Angela Brown's written amazingly about this, but just it's about taking control again, creating the right conditions. So whatever the conversation is that you need to have. So where are you going to be sitting? Who's going to be, I mean, I know Mike's probably going to talk about power later, but are we going to, who's going to sit above whom? No, we're not going to sit above one another. We're going to pay attention to the power dynamics. We're going to make sure that we're clear about what we want to achieve from the conversation. I've been known to script conversations, you know, with a particularly badly behaving group of adults. I've been known to actually write down 3 things that I want to achieve from that conversation and almost script it for myself. So it's about creating the conditions. It's about setting up a time and space and really honoring that time and that space, and really following through and then summarizing. Listen to what the person's actually saying. That's what I've learned as a coach as well, is to not put words in their mouth. It's so easy to say, oh, I hear you saying you're grumpy, when the person isn't actually saying they're grumpy. They're saying they feel uncomfortable or threatened or vulnerable. Use their words back to them and then summarize some real actions as a result of that conversation. So now what are we going to do? So now I will do this and you will do this and we will revisit at this point. Have we lost Sinead?
No, you have not lost me.
Sorry, you disappeared from my screen. I lost you, but we didn't. So that's
I'm really appreciating your focus on listening, because it's one of those things, listening, isn't it, where we all kind of can roll our eyes and think, oh yeah, listening, that's right, we're forever talking about it. And yet I have yet to come to any learning about good conversation that doesn't fundamentally require us to listen better. You know, whatever that situation, whether it's professional or personal, it's such a basic thing, and yet it can be so difficult for us to get our own voices out of our heads and allow ourselves to hear the other person in all of that. Ella, when we think about conversations with peers and colleagues, how, you know, if you're setting yourself up for a conversation with a peer or a colleague, how are you thinking about setting that up?
By focusing on myself to start with, that sounds awfully selfish, doesn't it? Should be thinking about somebody else. But I think what's really, really important in having meaningful conversations with people is to check in with yourself first and do a bit of self-regulation. I know that if I am very sympathetically aroused, if I'm dysregulated, and I go off for my presence walk around school, I am going to very much create the weather and tone with that. So I'm going to stomp around spreading the stress rather than creating the safe havens that you want for conversations. So I would absolutely always check in with myself before I seek any connection with somebody else. And sometimes to do that, I need some co-regulation from another person. So the deputy and I have a great relationship, a great understanding of each other. If I need to have a difficult conversation, or I am going to check in with a colleague about their mental health, I will make sure that I'm regulated first. And that might mean me seeking some co-regulation from the deputy. So I might go down and say, I need to go and have a tricky conversation and I'm feeling stressed. And she will have a conversation with me that helps to bring me to a place where I am within my window of tolerance. I'm thinking and feeling at the same time, so that I am then entering the conversation with the other person, able to be fully present and calm. I think the listening thing is really, really important that you've been talking about. And I would also add into that listening to what's not being said. So we talk a lot with the children about behaviour is communication. And that absolutely extends out to adults. It applies to all people. So if I ask a colleague how they are and they say, I'm fine, but their body is tense, their shoulders are up here, their fists are tight, their body is telling me that possibly they're not fine. So I would listen to what is being said in those non-verbal cues as well as what the words are telling me. And then thinking about the space. So that doesn't necessarily mean I'm in the corridor, I've asked how they are, they've said they're fine, their body looks like maybe they're not. I'm not going to stand in that corridor and force them to admit that they're not feeling okay. I might carry on with my walk, speak to everybody else, but then later on in the day, maybe take that person a cup of tea, find a space that we can, they can feel comfortable, they can feel safe and secure to say, I'm just checking you are all right because you seemed quite tense earlier, or I noticed your fists were clenched when we were talking. Is everything all right? Is there anything I need to know? And maybe revisiting that at a different time with them. So I would start with me, check I'm okay, listen to what's not being said as well as what is being said, and then not be afraid to circle back to that conversation, but in a space that feels like it's okay. And I know that's something that Mike is quite passionate about as well, in terms of the power that then comes into those conversations.
The whole piece around what's not being said is so key, isn't it? And this is, I know, something we'll speak a bit more about. Mike, we've signposted this point of power, and I'm going to say again to everybody in the room, if there are particular aspects of this topic and conversation more broadly that you want us to be talking about, stick your questions or remarks into the chat, and we'll integrate that into this conversation. But Mike, power, talk to us about that. Why is that relevant here?
Power is a big one. School communities are wide communities. They involve lots of different people with different experiences, different roles. So for me, conversations should involve a redistribution of power. So to expect somebody to come to me as a head with, say for instance, a teaching assistant, vitally important staff, vitally important that our whole system depend upon, but let's be honest, who are paid often pittance, and also have, limited time as well. They don't always have they're not contracted till, the time that many other staff are. So to expect them to stay behind at the end of the school day and have those conversations is particularly difficult sometimes. So we have to think about how that power dynamic plays out. Also, a brilliant thing that Ella and Emma talked about earlier, thinking about power again, is that if I call a member of staff to have a conversation with me, there are preconditions to that conversation that I have just assumed, which are that they're going to come into my office. So I'm presuming that the conversation needs to take place in there. I'm presuming that they're going to be able to make the time to have that conversation that particular day. And it will sometimes be appropriate for that to happen. But there's almost what I call two-step conversations that I like to make sure that we follow in the workplaces that I work in. So first of all, it's about creating the climate and the culture in which those conversations can take place. Because with the best one in the world, if we're telling people to talk, actually, there are lots of different things in that we need to think about before we even arrive at the conversation. So I need to have made sure I set the right climate, I model, and I also have the right culture in my school to have those conversations to begin with. Then it becomes a conversation about the conversation. So where does it take place? How does it work? What's the dynamic? And I'm a very, very, very big believer in that basic needs need to be met through that conversation. So Ella talked brilliantly about regulation earlier. So I always, if I'm going to have a conversation with people, I always make sure that, they might need to have access to a drink. They might need to have access to food, especially if they're quite nervous, their mouth is going to be dry. I need to think about the temperature of the room, the same way I would with some of the children with sensory processing difficulties. Somebody sitting in a very hot room when they're already anxious for that drink, that's already just creating conditions in the climate where that conversation has the ability to not go in the direction that we both wanted to go in. So those two-step conversations are almost a conversation about how the conversation is going to take place. Why could I not go down to where they are? Why could I not go and have that conversation with somebody else? And I was just coming on to this point, I could see somebody brilliantly brought this up. What if the person at the very top of that chain, at the very top of that culture, is not somebody who you're able to have that conversation with? And that presents itself a big problem, doesn't it? And what happens also if they say that they are good at having those conversations, they're approachable, but your experience is that they're not? Which is often something that many people talk to me about in the school community. So I always tell people that actually, an open door policy is fantastic. But if that open door policy within school and learning communities takes place, and it's just with one person or it's just with leaders, then we are not equipping people to have productive conversations, because the research is very clear on this, that most people will have the conversations with their peers first. And most people would have those conversations with middle leadership first. So my question always, when we're talking about conversations and we're talking about culture and we're talking about challenging conversations, all of those things, you must not start with your leadership. You must start with your middle leaders, your heads of department, your experienced practitioners on the ground, and your support staff. That's where you start. How do we equip them? Do they have line management training? Those people that have often gone up the chain and into heads of subject roles, all of those things. It's very, very well as having conversations about, leadership. And actually those conversations take place, middle leaders, support staff, HR, all of those departments. Do they have access to the right training, the right expertise? Last point I'll make, and this is about language. We tell people to talk all the time, don't we? There's big campaigns around mental health, which says, it's really important to talk. But in my experience, people really have the language. So in the same way that in curriculum time, we would make sure that we have language stems for our students and young people in order to help them articulate. And we do a lot of work around children and young people articulating emotions and feelings and all of those things. We need to have the same language stems for either challenging conversations, well-being conversations for adults, because I know lots of adults who have been children, So actually, if we're scaffolding that for our children, we need to scaffold that for our adults too. That language is not easy to come by. I see lots of people who walk in and then they slowly close up because they don't have the language. So could we have some way in which we could maybe distribute those language stems and those sentence stems to people, or maybe structure that within policies? Mine often exists within those school policies a lot of the time, in that they have a practical sheet that they can go away with in that policy to use some of those sentence stems to help them bring up those conversations in the right and professional ways. So that's just a couple of things that I was thinking of off the points that were raised already. But power is something I wish more leaders yielded, A, properly, and B, understood how they yielded it as well.
Thanks a million, Mike. Thank you. Emma, I know that you want to say something, and Ella, I can see that you do too. So Emma and then Ella.
So just linked to that point about power, it's really important to acknowledge here that, rightly or wrongly, usually wrongly, our schools are deeply hierarchical places. So you often talk to teachers, new teachers entering the profession, perhaps later in life, who say, why does everyone speak to me as if I'm 8 years old? So those hierarchies are deeply ingrained in schools. So to acknowledge that first, and secondly, to add an extra step to Mike's two-step conversation, which is the way you actually plan the conversation. To this day, my blood runs cold when someone senior to me says, Emma, can we just have a chat? Because it sets me into an old pattern of trying to work out what I've done wrong this week. So if you wield power and you are going to have a conversation with someone, for goodness sake, tell them what it's about. It sounds so obvious, but saying to someone, can we just a chat at 4 o'clock on Friday, you can ruin their entire week with that. So actually, I'd just like to follow up on that point you made in that meeting, or I'd like to talk to you more about that trip you're organising. It's not hard, and it's something that is so often omitted. Sometimes you might want to flip it, where you really do want to have a serious conversation, and you want someone to actually wake up and can we have a talk about the way you spoke to me during that meeting? That's fine, but be mindful of the power you yield and the potential you have by saying those little words, can we have a chat, to ruin someone's week and trigger all sorts of anxious responses.
Great, Emma. Ella, you want to come in there as well?
Thank you. Yeah, I think there's a few different thoughts that were kind of coming into my head listening to Mike there. I think one was sort of to pick up from the question around what do you do if there is that toxicity above you and you don't feel comfortable having those conversations. And I would say that it's even more important to have a conversation at those times, but not necessarily with that person. So finding someone who you can have the conversation with to talk through the fact that you're feeling that block or that toxicity and that's what you're experiencing. That might be a peer, it might be a colleague, it might be someone outside of work, or it might be someone like the education support helpline that's completely separate to that, there's something that can be really silencing around that toxicity. I'm not okay, I'm struggling, and the person I should be speaking to about that is part of the cause of that feeling for me. And so actually being able to find a way to still have the conversation, but have it with someone that it feels safe for you to talk to, and seeking that outside of your workplace if you need to. It might be a union, like I say, a friend, a colleague, someone like education support. It's even more important to have it and not be silenced, because that toxicity will silence everybody, and then there's no way of that changing. And I think then for the person that's in the position of power, exactly those examples of how you can try and break some of that down. And I think there's some really important work there around authenticity and vulnerability. And that if you are going to have really meaningful conversations as a person in power, then sometimes you have to be the person that's expressed the vulnerability. So it took me a long time. I had to work on that very, very hard. But sometimes when the staff in school say to me, how are you having a good day? I will say, no, I'm feeling really stressed at the moment, actually. Or, I had a terrible weekend. I was up at night thinking about something, worrying it. It's always boundaried. I am aware of not having a negative impact on other people's emotional well-being, but I have to find appropriate ways to share that vulnerability in my position of power, because how can I expect the staff or the team to tell me when they're not okay if I am this impenetrable bubble of positivity and everything always being brilliant? So finding appropriate ways to share your vulnerability, and that can be a great opportunity to role model some of those scripts or phrases. So like Mike was saying, if your policy has some example phrases in for talking about well-being, what can be more impactful than hearing the head use some of those in the corridors around school or in conversations, rather than it being something that other people use as a tool to talk to me? It's something I use when I'm talking with them as well.
That's brilliant, Ella, and I really relate to that. And I think it's something that we need to do more work with our new leaders on. I'm very aware when I became chief executive here, I had come out of a role of being a senior person who got stuff done, like that's what I was good at. And I didn't have a lot of experience of being vulnerable, because that's not the job of someone who gets stuff done. That's not what you're doing. And to learn how to be more human, how to be more authentic, and to navigate that boundary of when is it okay to share something, and when is it, and actually when is it not okay to share something, I think it's a real craft. And I don't think we give our new leaders enough time to reflect and enough support to think about how they evolve in that way. So I think there's something very much for us to take away. I'm also struck, there's a question in the chat around the sentence stems. Where can we find these sentence stems? And I think we'll have a think about what can be done to support colleagues there, and to see if we can produce something that will sit alongside this webinar, maybe on the website. I know Gemma and the team will have a look to see what we can do there. I've got, and in fact I have it on the wall behind my laptop, a list of, I would say, about 25 or 30 questions that because I'm not always very good at finding a good question when somebody's having when a conversation is difficult or someone's in difficulty. And so that would be for me, the prompt is, what are good open questions, safe questions that I can ask that don't put pressure on someone? And I've had them for 100 years, but I still keep them up, because sometimes if you're in the conversation, and even if you're the more powerful person, you can get flustered, or you can get, your own tension can rise, and we don't think well when we're stressed. That's not when we come into our own, even if you've gone into the conversation, as Ella suggests, and you're well regulated. In the course of the conversation, you can be thrown. And so I think having this scaffolding around us is really important. Mike.
Yeah, I just wanted to quickly say something that just came into my thinking was about proactive conversations as well. So, we're talking quite a lot here about times where people have had to go away and have these thoughts and reflections in their minds for quite a long period of time. And very often what I find is that things have manifested and have become more complex with our own thinking before we said them out loud. And often, sometimes in healthy conversations, having that bit of perspective or understanding has been really useful in breaking down those things. But an example of that would be a lot of these issues stem from things that are happening on the shop floor. And I think sometimes, that one of the main reasons as to why staff in the school environment find leaders sometimes disconnected from the feelings and the strength of feeling in their day-to-day experiences is because systems don't always operate well. And one of the things that has had a real impact in the schools that sometimes I've worked with have been where actually there's a post-incident policy, which is where there's an incident that's taken place. I'm talking about a serious level incident, but any type of incident, whether it be behaviour, whatever it is, there's been a post-incident debrief with that member of staff. So it's given them an automatic conversation, and they might not need to have it there and then. They might say, actually, do you know what? I'm totally good and I'm totally fine. But it's building it into our systems and responses as part of our culture. So I don't think an effective culture can just be led by people. It's got to also infiltrate systems, right? So making sure that we're having systematic responses to people's feelings and thoughts and reflections. The post-incident debrief is an exact policy that would kick in at those times when actually, regardless of whether you feel you need to have a conversation anyway, there's a conversation available to you. So it doesn't mean you have to ask for it because it's automatic. So that conversation wouldn't necessarily be with me, but it might be with your head of department, or it might be with the senior teacher, or it might be with pastoral. So that automatically makes sure that we're building that network of safety rather than just having one dedicated person that deals with all of those things. So I was just thinking about that when you were speaking earlier, Sinead.
The fact of not having to ask, that the structure is there, is incredibly powerful, I think, and really one for us all to take away and think about. Ella.
Yeah, I think someone who knows me very well once described me as systems and processes with love. So I'm all about the people, but the systems and processes have to be there underneath it. And when the topic of conversations first came up as an idea, one of the things I was thinking about, how do we have more of these conversations about mental health and well-being? And I was like, well, actually, we start to have more conversations about mental health and well-being by just having more conversations. And then my thought process kind of went in two different ways, and it links really well with what Mike was speaking about there, in that I think we need routine conversations built into systems, and then have environments and cultures where spontaneous conversations can take place in response to things that have happened. So, for example, in the school where I am currently, the start of every performance management meeting has a good 10-15 minute chunk that is a conversation purely about well-being. And again, it's structured, it has set questions that we ask, so you don't have to answer them, you can just say I'm fine, but I'm going to ask the questions every time anyway. We do it with the children and parents on the gate at the start of every day, and at the end of every day the senior leaders are there and we say hello. And you can ignore us every morning if you want to, but I'm still going to ask you the question when I see you, because actually that becomes part of a routine, and it shows you that I'm here and I'm holding that boundary and I do care enough that even if you don't want to participate yet, I'm here. So those routine opportunities. And linked with what Mike was saying about sort of the shared language and people sometimes not having the words to talk about how they're feeling, a lot of our routine conversations here start with a non-verbal check-in. So we will use something called a blob tree or an A4 sheet that's got lots of different emojis on it, and everybody in the meeting will be given it, and we will say, right, just take 5 minutes on your own now to have a look, which one of these are you today? And then we'll have time at the start of that meeting to go around and say, okay, would anybody like to share? You can tell us which one it is. You can tell us why you might feel that way if you want to. So some people will just point because they don't have the language. But again, it's those routine opportunities within the systems that the conversations happen. And I find that has begun to leak into the culture and has started to leak into the spontaneous conversation. So a member of staff who does struggle with the words or the language to share how they're feeling might stop me on the corridor and saying, crikey, I'm the blob that's hanging on with one hand today.
Yeah, love it. It's brilliant. My colleague Lara does this with pasta shapes. She's on the call somewhere, but she's a great woman for a load of pasta shapes, and pick the one that's how you're feeling today, which I believe is very successful with a group. Emma.
Yes, so I keep thinking of things. So blob tree. So thanks to Ella's suggestion, I used the blob tree. So if you haven't heard of it, it's the tree with lots of stick figures, some are hanging, some are stomping, some are flying at the top. I used it with a group of 40 head teachers the other day, Ella, and it went down a complete storm. And one of them said they were the one lying on their front having a strop because they'd designed a well-being room for their staff and someone had complained about the colour. So anyway, very powerful. You literally can't win sometimes. What did I want to say? I wanted to say the older I get. So I was that intuitive teacher who left everyone overnight, but that was okay. I was enacting my craft and I was weaving my magic in the classroom. And so I didn't need to worry about things like paperwork and where I was storing books. And the older I get, the more teachers I come into contact with, the more I passionately believe in what Ella said about systems and processes and protocols. Without those, you cannot have a culture of well-being. People have to know what their job description is, how a break duty looks, when they're going to have time to go to the loo. Nothing works unless those basic things have been really thought out by leaders. And then I can't remember what it came from, but I think it was Mike, exit interviews. In case it doesn't get mentioned, it's that time of year. Okay, so it's 31st of May coming up. If you are in a member of leadership or wellbeing team, or you have any influence in your school at all, actually, or if you're leaving, ask for an exit interview. There are two reasons for this. One is I think goodbyes are really important. So if you're closing a chapter on school you are at, for whatever reason, the way you say goodbye, for your dignity, for your happiness, for your confidence, and for actually coming back to feeling like you just said it and you've been heard, is really important. But secondly, that data for schools on why staff are leaving is so powerful. And it doesn't have to be your line manager. It can be a member of HR that you've never met before. You don't have to do an exit interview with your head teacher where you say, actually, that time when you forgot to ask me about my sick cat made me so upset that actually I've left now, or you undermined me, or you made me feel small. It can be with someone in the wellbeing team or the HR team, but have the exit interview. It's so important, just in case we don't get onto it later.
I love that. And as a school governor, I would also say that as a governor, we're wanting to see the exit interview trends. It really matters. And I would see that as a fantastic source of insight into how the staff team are. So I would echo that absolutely, Emma. I want to turn us to, I'm torn now. I want to go two ways. One, I've got in my head this thing about as leaders, as people having conversations, the work of Chris Argyris around having good conversations. We often slide into assumption, and that whole piece around assumption. And as we're leaders and we're busy, we often, even are the worst of this because we think we know everything, frankly. Or maybe that's just me, but I don't think it's just me. I think most leaders think they know everything in the nicest possible way. We can come back to humility, but we forget. In moments, we forget because we know a lot, right? But assumptions are really important for us to understand how to come back and break this down. So that's one little seed I'm throwing out there. But the other piece I'm interested in is we've talked a lot about conversations that are difficult conversations. And actually, I think we are possibly even more rubbish at having positive conversations. I think that we neglect them, we don't attend to them. And I'm really curious what you all think, because I think positive conversations, and well, anyway, I'll stop because you don't need to know what I think. What do you think? And I'm not putting anyone on the spot, so fingers on the triggers. Who's off the mic first? Emma's in.
Okay, I had and tragically she died after a short illness when she was 47. She was called Sheila. And in memory of Sheila, I'm going to encourage you all to do this. One of Sheila's policies in life was if someone looked beautiful, and she walked past someone in the street and they looked really stylish and really amazing, she would stop them in the street and tell them they looked amazing. And in memory of Sheila, it works everywhere except on the London Underground. On the London Underground, you get funny looks. But if you stop someone and say, oh my goodness, that dress is such a glorious colour, guaranteed. But so that is serious. On a related note, just taking the time to say to someone, my dad brought me up to say, if someone does a good job, tell them. So I do spend a lot of time in my life going back to restaurants and GP surgeries and lovely vet receptionists and saying, thank you so much for taking the time, for I really appreciated it. And again, it's that lack thereof, isn't it, in schools, that sometimes happens when people are busy. I did this big thing for our students and no one in the staff has said thank you. So just the little thank, really appreciate it. Or the exchanges of humour. We haven't talked about humour yet. Humour and the research around humour, and humour gives us control over the uncontrollable, doesn't it? Those then bonds us and unites us, and God, we haven't had enough laughter during COVID. So just creating those moments. So scattergun of suggestions there from me, and I will be quiet now.
Oh, don't be quiet for too long. I think the humor is a funny one, isn't it? I didn't mean that. That came out that way. That was not intentional. Ella, you're going to totally dig me out of this hell. But humor is one where I think I'm more or less safe on this these days. But certainly when I was younger, I wasn't always sure how to calibrate it. And I went through a very difficult experience with my best friend had terminal cancer, and it was very, very difficult. It's a long time ago. It's 20 years ago. And actually that was the most, it was such a growthful experience, because we made the worst possible jokes in the worst possible taste, the blackest humor at the darkest hours. And as she would say, I'm dying, who's going to tell me off? And there was something so liberating about being able to laugh, even in the face of real difficulty. And I think it's easy to be afraid sometimes to have a laugh and to use humor, but actually it is such a great leveler and such a force for humanity, I think, in relationships. And I mean humor, I don't mean sarcasm, humor being the thing that we all laugh at, not we laugh at somebody, but something we can say and we can all collectively laugh about. Ella.
Yeah, I think that idea of, I'm going to steal Emma's phrase of scattergunning fun and play. I think play is something that can be massively missing, and opportunities for shared play and shared experiences and things that really, bring people joy. So we try and create opportunities in school that might ignite those positive conversations. So when it was Valentine's, I left a little thing on everybody's desk or in their pigeonhole for them that just, had some little quotes in, or a little chocolate or something that then people would talk about because it was shared. They all had that experience. I think, Mike was saying earlier, we all bring our own lives to work and we've all got different lives and different experiences. So creating opportunities for everybody to share an experience gives an opportunity for everybody to have conversations that are more positive. So as I walked around that day, I could see the cleaners speaking to the teachers about what they'd got in their bag. I could see the lunchtime organisers speaking to the office staff saying, what was your quote that was about love or self-care? Food is a great one for us here, having opportunities where we have a shared breakfast. So we put a range of different foods on for people to come together before school if they want to. And so there's opportunities for play and shared experiences that mean you can connect and talk about the same things that have a bit more fun or humour to them. The deputy sends an email of the week with a joke in, and some of them are terrible, really terrible, but they're the best ones, because then I can just walk around the corridor saying, did you see that terrible joke? And it sparks the conversation in a different way that will end up somewhere completely different to the thing we started talking about, but just brings that joy and that lightness to the day.
Lovely, lovely. If anyone needs a source for bad jokes, I'm happy to volunteer my 11-year-old son, who's currently specialising in this as a theme. Mike, we've all had the situation, well, we may not, but many of us will have had the situation where, do you see how I caught that assumption? Many of us may have had the situation where we know someone, we're working with someone who we think is not in great shape, who we're a bit concerned about, who we're seeing some behavior that just doesn't seem quite themselves, or it's problematic for others, but it's out of character. And we may have seen somebody try to call them on it and they be a bit prickly or a bit difficult. And we then may be feeling less confident about how to approach that conversation, either because somebody's tried it before, or because we're a bit scared of what the response might be. How do we set ourselves up to do that well and to engage in that, approach that conversation with sensitivity and care?
So I think the mother of all questions. Because I think everybody, including me, has experiences here of where that conversation's gone well and where it hasn't. And, you know, as somebody on both ends of that conversation, both sides of the table, I can tell you that there is no bit of set advice that I can give you that will cover every single scenario. So sorry, is the first thing I'd say. But B, one thing I would say is we all have a person. And when I say a person, we all have somebody in the workforce who it's obvious when you think of them, the person that you're thinking about, you automatically think of that other person, because you either A, always see them together, or they're always conversing, all of those things. So my number one suggestion normally is, if you're the person that's observed it, is to have a conversation with the person that is closest to them first, because that person is more likely to have a little bit more context, is more likely to maybe be a little bit more of a better judge character. Now, obviously, we need to be careful about how you do that and have those conversations. They need to be sensitive. But I almost always would have conversations to their closest colleague first, rather than broach it directly myself, originally. That goes with students at university. You know, I support a lot of students at university who who will always, the first thing that I ask them when I meet them in their first year is who they live with and who their friends are. Because sometimes I might need to triangulate a conversation or just an observation through those people. So it's always useful to have that little network of people that, you know, you may be able to have a conversation with. The last thing I'd just say about positivity, coming back to the last point, the more and more people I meet, the more I realise how those notes of positivity are absolutely vital. I see people who have boards above their laptops, for their workstations, of little notes and reminders when we're filled with self-doubt and when we're in those cycles. I've seen, you know, note jars where people have got experiences that they've written down, and I bring mine out on New Year's Eve and look at all the things that have happened throughout the year, all the little tiny things that we forget. So they mean an awful lot. And somebody once told me that actually, you know, in our school culture, we need to be mindful of, especially in secondary school, how different subjects are celebrated in different ways. I, as a PE teacher, you know, obviously PE is the best subject, and all PE teachers are fantastic. But I, as a PE teacher, would have much more opportunity to share in my school successes and culture by nature of my role. You know, I get to see the kids succeeding more because I see them experiencing different things. In a maths classroom, that's very different. So somebody once said to me, you know, school culture where you're celebrating successes needs to have equal opportunity for our PE teachers and our music teachers as it does for our maths and our science teachers, and all of those people that, you know, what part of the wider school community. So celebration of success is a big one, but it needs to be equal.
That's lovely. I'm going to come to Emma in a moment. I'm going to go to Ella first. And Emma, I know you'll want to lobby for the English department in the face of Mike's gratuitous flagging of PE expertise.
PE teachers have grown on me.
I'm marvellous. Excellent. Well, I'm going to leave you to think about that, and maybe also Wendy's comment in the chat, and I know you'll come back with something else because you're Emma and you'll give us even more value. So while you think about those, Wendy's asked a question just after your last comment or previous comment in the chat. Ella, I wanted to come to you and just ask about, you know, when we're talking about this as educators, we are doing our best to get it right. We don't always have colleagues in the moment that we can turn to. So you might have a colleague who you can have a conversation with, but that space isn't always there. What else can we do? Where else can we kind of find support, I suppose, and approach these things? And is it icky and weird, or is it okay to do that?
So I have to make sure I have extensive networks of support around me. I know I am someone that can need additional support to regulate myself. We talk at my school about passing things up, and then they land with me, and I need to be able to pass them out. The weight of all of those conversations can become very heavy for anybody within a school, but particularly someone who the buck stops with, and you might be having more of those trickier conversations. So I think for me, it's about having different options available, and like you say, that might not always be peers or colleagues. So we buy in professional supervision, which is great and is available for leaders regularly, and then all staff can drop into that. Similarly, sort of leadership coaches or external coaches coming in. But I know that can be really tricky for schools if budgets are very tight, or if I'm a senior leader and that's not something that my head is going to agree to. So I would, shameless plug, would very much recommend the peer support groups that Education Support offer. So I've used those as a head teacher. It was free to access. You know, any leaders can access them. It was very easy to do. I just had to drop an email across, so it didn't actually have to speak to somebody, because I can find that really overwhelming, speaking to someone on the phone that I don't know and asking for help. I could actually just send an email to access it, which was easier for me. But those peer support groups became a fantastic safe haven of leaders who were able to kind of strip themselves of their roles and be very vulnerable and authentic and human with each other, and offload some of the burden that those conversations can have, seek that help and support without fear of being judged or how that might come back from other people in the community. It was really, really helpful. Fantastic that it's available for free, because I know things like supervision are brilliant, but if your school can't afford it, or like I say, it's being blocked by people more senior to you, then it's accessible to you individually to be able to engage with.
Fantastic. Thank you, Ella. I really appreciate that. And actually, we do have some one-to-one supervision. I think we have 6 sessions available through a funded program currently. There's spaces on that, and my colleague Jen's posted a link so people will be able to access that. I'm going to come to, and just to say, actually, I do the same thing. I'm in a peer group, and I find it an incredibly rich space. There'll be days when I turn up and I have something to discuss, and then that's incredibly helpful. There'll be days when I turn up and I'm not bringing much, but hearing from other people is always a rich learning experience. So I couldn't agree more. I'm going to come to Emma because I said I would, and then I'm going to come back to each of you and ask you for the one kind of takeaway that if you could leave with people, you would want them to take. Emma.
Yeah, I just wanted to acknowledge a couple of the comments in the chat, particularly from Sarah and Wendy. And obviously, without knowing your details, it's very hard to specifically, so I won't. But we would love to believe that all schools are run by the Ellas of this world. Ella is marvellous, and I've worked with her extensively, and she's absolutely marvellous. There are some schools which struggle with communication. There are some schools which practice unconsciously, normally, toxic behaviours which have profound impact on people. And I think it's just important to say this. When I'm stuck, people with coaching, they often feel they're stuck. They have no choice. They have no choice but to either suck it up or leave the profession altogether. There are heads like Ella out there. If you are being badly treated, if you are being stonewalled, if you are not being supported and you are not being listened to, there is time before the 31st of May. And there is a large churn of teachers out there for all sorts of positive reasons. People are relocating, people are getting promotions, people are getting brave after COVID. There are jobs out there. And I could talk about the subtleties of this, but there isn't much time. So I just want to say, resigning is not as scary as you think it is. And if your job is making you miserable and having an impact on your mental health and your loved ones, then find a school which will value you for what you are worth.
Brilliant. Thank you, Emma. And they are out there. That's superb. Right. I'm going to ask you each for your one most important takeaway that you want people to leave with today. Mike. Sorry, I keep putting you first, Mike. Sorry about that.
I've really struggled with this one, actually, because there's lots, but so it won't necessarily be my most important one, but it would be the one that sits at the top of my mind. And it is that aspect of listening. I meet people all the time who have sadly had to go through lots of different people before they come to me, and their trust is broken. And their experiences have told them that it's not worth having a conversation because it's only ever gone badly. So my point would be is that if you're going to have a conversation with somebody, if you're the person that's initiating it or receiving it, that listening in order to understand is really something that I would suggest you do, rather than listening to respond. We're prompted all the time to try and fix things. We're prompted all the time to try and have something useful or profound to say. And very rarely, if I'm being honest, have I sat in a conversation and had something profound that moves somebody on. Sometimes it's just about listening appropriately, signposting appropriately, having a follow-up conversation. People often have a very good idea of their own solutions and their own needs and their own wants. Sometimes it's just helping them get there.
Brilliant. Thank you, Mike. Emma?
Teaching can be really lonely, and I know Education Support's done some work on this recently, offered some support around loneliness. You're surrounded by people, it can be incredibly lonely, especially if you're struggling, and you can feel incredibly isolated and as if you're the only one. And I suppose my key message, which I keep coming back to, is you're not alone, even if you feel like it at the time. There is always somebody out there who's going through a similar experience. There is education support literally at the end of a free phone line 24/7. There are people like me, Ella and Mike, who are on social media, who are always willing to listen and help where we can. Reaching out, it's always best to have the conversation than not have the conversation. Reach out, you're not alone.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Emma. And Ella?
I feel pressure now, going last. This might sound counterintuitive for a conversation about conversations, but mine would be to start with yourself. So we can't control other people. We often want to, but we can't. But you do have choices about yourself. So whether that is starting with the conversations you have with yourself internally to be able to then have more conversations with other people externally, or starting with yourself, whatever role you have within your workplace, how are you role modeling and leading by example with those conversations? Because you do have control and choice over what you're doing. And I would finish with one of my favorite people, who is Brené Brown, and one of her quotes that I love, which is talk to yourself like you would someone you love. And I think if you can start from that place, our conversations with everybody will be much more positive, hopefully.
Fantastic. I love that. And I know my colleague Jen is posting information into the chat with the free support and the resources and the reflective practice, e-learning, all of which is free. So that's appearing. I think I just want to highlight the one that for me just really landed today was when you were talking, Ella, about self-regulation, and it reminded me of the number of poor conversations I've had when I have not attended to myself first, when I have gone into them angry or irritated or hungry or hassled or whatever it is, and I have not attended to myself, and the conversation, shock horror, has not gone brilliantly. And that's not to say that simply attending to myself would make it better, but it is a great just personal checkpoint to put us in the best space, I think, to get to the best place that we can in that conversation. And that's what I would wish for everybody here today. I have to close because it's 5 o'clock and we could go on I could talk to these people all day, frankly. I'm very proud of myself because we didn't get too silly and didn't have too many laughs, but next time we will probably. Thank you all for attending. It's lovely to see so many people from so many different places and roles. There's lots of free support available. Do please take it away and look after yourselves. Have a good week. Thank you to the panel. You're all marvelous. And we really appreciate the support you give to education support. Take care, everybody. Good luck.